You deserve this place. My own son trapped me starving while he traveled abroad carefree. My name is Ella, and for most of my life I believed love was something you proved with sacrifice. I learned that belief early, when my husband walked out the door and never came back. Our son Henry was 8 then, all elbows and bright eyes, still small enough to fall asleep with his cheek pressed to my shoulder. I remember the way he asked, in a whisper as if loud words might make his father return, whether it was something he had done. I told him no, it was never him, and I said it so fiercely that I almost believed my own certainty could keep the world from shifting again. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. At 18 I had taken a job in a textile factory downtown, sewing seams until my fingers felt like they belonged to someone else. By 30 I was still there, still watching the clock and the bobbing needles, still bringing home fabric dust in my hair. Work was never glamorous, but it was steady, and steadiness was what we needed. I packed Henry's lunches in the dark before dawn. I ironed his shirts until the collars were crisp enough to pretend we were a family that didn't have holes in it. I learned the rhythm of survival. Wake, work, return, repeat. I told myself that if I kept moving, nothing could catch me. One rainy Tuesday in October, Henry came home dragging his backpack like it weighed more than he did. His cheeks were streaked with tears he refused to wipe, and he kept his eyes fixed on the floor as if he could disappear into it. When I coaxed the truth out of him, it tumbled out in broken pieces. Other kids had laughed at his worn-out sneakers, called him names, made him feel small. I checked the soles that night and saw the truth in the thin rubber and the frayed stitching. After he fell asleep, I took out the envelope where I kept my savings for myself, money I had tucked away for months to buy a new dress. I counted the bills twice, hands trembling, then folded them back into my purse and decided the dress could wait forever. The next day, after my shift ended, I went to the store and bought the best sneakers I could afford. Henry's face lit up when he opened the box, and in that moment I felt something like victory. Not the loud kind, not the kind people celebrate, but the quiet victory of a mother who had found a way to protect her child from shame. I told myself that this was what love looked like, and I let that belief sink deep into my bones. Years moved forward like fabric sliding under a needle, one straight line at a time, fast enough to blur, slow enough to hurt. I worked overtime whenever it was offered. When Henry was 16 and begged for a motorcycle, I took double shifts until my wrists ached and my eyes burned, and then I watched him ride in circles on the empty street, laughing into the wind. When he turned 21 and was accepted into an engineering program, I mortgaged my small house and told myself it was an investment in his future, that one day he would stand steady in a world that had tried to tip us over. I didn't allow myself to wonder what would happen if my body failed before that day arrived. I didn't allow myself to want anything that wasn't tied to him. Henry graduated with honors. He held his diploma like it was a passport, and in a way it was. He got a job at a construction company and began to dress in suits that made him look older than his years. He carried a leather briefcase and talked about projects and deadlines and colleagues with the energy of someone discovering what it meant to be respected. On the mornings he visited before work, he would kiss my forehead and say, "I did it, Mom," and I would believe the story I had told myself for decades. That sacrifice created gratitude, that love created loyalty, that a mother who gave everything would be held gently in return. For the first few years after he started his career, Henry seemed like the son I had dreamed of. He came by often, took me out to dinner sometimes, and spoke about me proudly to people who did not know my life. When neighbors asked how he was doing, I would smile and feel warmth spread through my chest as I told them he was successful, that he was kind, that he never forgot where he came from. I felt as if the past had paid its debt. Then he met Marlene. The first time he brought her to my home, I tried to welcome her the way I had always imagined I would welcome the woman my son chose. I set the table with my best dishes and cooked until the kitchen was warm with steam and the smell of herbs. Marlene arrived in a neat coat, hair perfectly styled, a smile polished like a mirror. She was 32 then, tall and composed, with eyes that assessed everything in a single sweep. The living room, the curtains, the scuffed floor near the doorway, the framed photographs on the wall. Henry beamed beside her, proud to show her his roots, as if he expected her to find beauty in the simplicity. Instead, she offered compliments that felt like they had been practiced in advance. "This is cozy," she said, and her voice carried the faintest hesitation, as if she was searching for a kinder word and settling for the safest one. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself she was nervous. People were different. Times were different. I tried again and again to make room for her. When they visited, I cooked dishes Henry had told me were her favorites, even ones I had never made before. I bought small gifts, a scarf, a set of scented soaps, a cookbook she'd mentioned. Each gesture met the same response, a soft laugh, a brief thank you, and an undercurrent of dismissal that sat in the air like smoke. "Ella, you don't have to go to so much trouble," she would say, the tone sweet enough to fool anyone who wasn't listening closely. "We're adults. We can take care of ourselves." But I could see the quiet message beneath the words. "You are not needed. You are extra. You are in the way." When Henry wasn't looking, I would catch her gaze lingering on him in a particular way, not tender, not admiring, but calculating, like someone protecting an asset from risk. If I spoke too long about Henry's childhood, she would tilt her head as if the past were an annoyance. If I mentioned my work, she nodded politely, the way people nod at stories they don't value. Once, when I said I was proud of Henry for staying humble, she smiled and replied, "Ambition isn't humility," as if humility were a flaw he should outgrow. The wedding came 2 years later, held in a hall so elegant I felt underdressed no matter what I wore. Marlene planned everything herself, flowers, music, guest list, while I stood on the edges of the process like a distant cousin instead of the mother of the groom. When I suggested including a family tradition, a small ritual my mother had taught me, Marlene's smile tightened. "That's charming," she said, and the way she said it made the words sound like a punishment. "But we're doing something modern. Our guests wouldn't relate to something so old-fashioned." Henry, who once would have defended me with quick certainty, only nodded and changed the subject. I watched him slip into that habit of smoothing things over, of choosing the easiest piece instead of the honest one. Each time he did it, a thread snapped quietly inside me. On the wedding day, I sat in the front row wearing a green dress from a discount store, hands folded in my lap. Henry looked handsome and nervous. Marlene looked flawless. When the officiant spoke about respect and family, I watched Marlene squeeze Henry's hand and felt something cold slide through my chest. It wasn't a superstition or a omen exactly. It was the clear sensation of being shifted out of place, like a chair moved to make room for someone else. After the ceremony, I hosted a small dinner at my house for the few relatives who could come. I washed dishes while conversation drifted through open windows, the night air cool on my arms. That was when I overheard Marlene and her mother outside, their voices carrying across the backyard. They didn't know I was within earshot. "Now that we're married, we need boundaries," Marlene said. "Henry is too soft with his mother. She still thinks she's the center of his world." Her mother laughed, a sharp, satisfied sound. "Men need their wives to open their eyes. A meddling mother can ruin a marriage before it even starts." I stood at the sink with a wet plate in my hands, unable to move. The words didn't just sting. They rearranged everything I thought I understood. I had tried to be kind, to be welcoming, to be flexible. They weren't talking about kindness. They were talking about control. I finished cleaning with tears sliding down my face, quiet enough that no one noticed. In the months that followed, Henry's visits changed shape. He came less often, and when he did come he was usually with Marlene, and time with him felt rationed. Our conversations turned cautious, interrupted by Marlene's reminders and little comments that sounded helpful but landed like stones. "Henry, don't forget we have dinner with my parents," she'd say whenever he relaxed. Or, "Your mother looks tired, honey, maybe we should let her rest," as if my desire to talk were a symptom of illness. At first I tried to ignore it. I told myself this was normal, that a new marriage needed space. But then Henry began to look at my house like it was a place he visited out of duty. His hugs became brief. His attention wandered. Sometimes he would scroll his phone at my table while I spoke, as if my words were background noise. The loving young man I had raised seemed to be fading, replaced by someone who regarded my life as an inconvenience. The first time he spoke to me with contempt was a Sunday afternoon 3 months after the wedding. I had cooked his favorite chicken stew, the one he used to request on birthdays, and I set it on the table in the ceramic dish with red flowers I'd bought when he was 16. When Henry arrived, he was alone, and hope lifted in me like a sudden breath. Maybe this would be a normal visit. Maybe we could talk without an audience. He sat down without the old warmth, stared at the stew as if he were evaluating it, then cleared his throat. "Mom, we need to talk," he said. I sat across from him, smoothing my napkin with fingers that suddenly felt clumsy. "Of course," I replied. "What's wrong?" "Marlene and I have been thinking," he began, still not looking me in the eye. "We think it would be better if we had more space." The word space landed between us like a wall. "Space," I repeated. "Henry, you only come once a week." "It's affecting our marriage," he said, stirring the stew as if the surface needed rearranging. "Marlene says we don't have enough intimacy as a couple because I'm always here." I felt my face heat, a mix of shame and disbelief. "Always here," I said softly. "You're my son. I look forward to seeing you." He finally looked up, and the irritation in his eyes startled me. "That's the problem," he snapped. "I'm the only thing you have. Do you realize how suffocating that is? I'm 30, Mom. I can't be responsible for your happiness." The words cut so cleanly I couldn't breathe. I had spent decades keeping him safe from discomfort, and now he was telling me my love was a burden. "I never asked you to be responsible for my happiness," I said, voice trembling despite my effort to stay steady. "I just wanted you in my life." "Love shouldn't be a prison," he replied, and I recognized the phrasing immediately. Too polished, too rehearsed. "You need to understand I have a new family now. New priorities. I can't keep living to please you." I stared at him, trying to find the boy I knew in the face of the man across from me. I saw only distance. The stew steamed between us, untouched. He ate a few bites as if out of obligation, then pushed the plate away and stood. "I have to go," he said, already turning toward the door. "Henry," I whispered, but he didn't stop. The door clicked shut behind him, and the quiet that followed felt heavier than the one after my husband left. I stood alone in my kitchen, looking at the full plate growing cold, and I felt something inside me crack. Not all at once, but like a seam giving way after too much strain. That evening, I walked through my living room and looked at the photographs on the walls. Henry in a school uniform, Henry holding a math medal, Henry in a graduation cap. Each image was proof of a story I had told myself, that my sacrifices meant something, that love repaid love. I touched one frame, then another, as if I could steady myself by steadying them. Outside, the sky darkened. In the stillness of my home, I heard, for the first time, the echo of a question I had never allowed myself to ask. What if everything I had done alone? I tried to sleep, but his words kept circling in my head, sharp as needles. I made tea I didn't drink. I folded laundry that didn't need folding. Near midnight I sat at the kitchen table and listened to the refrigerator hum, wondering how a home that once felt crowded with purpose could suddenly feel like a wide, empty room. The next morning I stepped onto the porch to water my geraniums. My neighbor was outside, trimming her rose bushes with steady hands. She was a widow in her 70s, the kind of woman who noticed when curtains stayed closed too long. "Morning, Ella," she called, and the warmth in her voice made my throat tighten. "You okay?" she asked, studying my face. "I'm fine," I lied, because the truth felt too big to speak. But as I turned back toward my door, a quiet realization settled in me. Lately and had seen more of my daily life than my own son had. I didn't know what to do with that thought yet. I only knew it hurt, and it was real. For the first time, I feared the worst chapters were still ahead. After that Sunday, the calendar lost its rhythm. I kept cooking out of habit, setting 2 plates before I remembered there was only one person in the house. I kept buying groceries as if Henry might appear with a sudden grin and an apology. Each time the phone rang, my heart jumped, then sank when there was a stranger on the line. I told myself I was being foolish. A grown man had his own life. A mother should understand. Henry did call, but not the way he used to. The calls were short, the words clipped, as if he were checking a task off a list. When I asked how he was, he answered in generalities. When I tried to tell him about my day, he interrupted with reminders about time. "Marlene and I have to go," he would say, or, "We're heading out, Mom." Even when Marlene's voice wasn't on the line, she seemed to be there, hovering behind his words like a shadow he had learned to obey. When he finally visited again, Marlene came with him, dressed as if my small living room were a formal appointment. She looked around with a faint grimace, then sat upright on my sofa and crossed her legs in a way that made it clear she would not be staying long. Henry glanced at her every few minutes, as if checking that he was performing correctly. I offered coffee, asked about work, and asked about their new place. Marlene answered as if she were giving a presentation. "We're thinking of upgrading," she said, stirring sugar into her cup with quick, precise movements. "Something larger. More secure." Her eyes flicked to my faded curtains and the scuffed edge of my coffee table. "It's important to live among people who share your standards." Henry nodded along, chewing the cake I had baked as if it were fuel. When I asked what that meant for my house, Henry shrugged. "It's yours, Mom," he said. "You can do what you want with it. We won't be needing it." The words were casual, almost careless, and they stung more than any outright insult. I had raised him in these rooms. Now the house was an object he had outgrown. I wanted to argue, to remind him of everything this place held, but Marlene smiled as if the matter had been settled years ago. After that, Henry's visits thinned further. I saw him every 2 or 3 weeks, always with Marlene, always in a hurry. They would arrive and stand near the doorway, like guests deciding whether a room was worth their time. Marlene would comment on the weeds in the yard or the dust on the windowsill, dressing each criticism as concern. "Ella, you should really consider simplifying," she'd say. "At your age, you don't want to overwork yourself." If I tried to change the subject, she would smile and steer it back, as if my home were a file she needed to organize. Then came the first time Henry asked for money. He called on a weekday evening, sounding unusually upbeat. "Mom," he said, with a brightness that made me hopeful for a second, "can you help me out?" "Just temporarily." My stomach tightened, because I recognized the shape of that sentence. "What do you need?" I asked, already calculating what I could spare. $5,000, he said quickly. "Marlene's car is having issues. She needs something better for work. It's just a down payment. I'll pay you back in 3 months." $5,000 was nearly everything I had saved, money I had put away for emergencies I tried not to name. But the old reflex rose in me. Protect Henry, smooth the path. I heard myself say yes. He thanked me in a tone that sounded almost like the old Henry, and I clung to that sound as if it meant he still cared. He did not pay it back. At first I didn't press. 3 months passed, and I waited, telling myself he must be busy. When I finally mentioned it, he laughed as if I were being silly. "Of course," he said. "We've just had a lot going on." Another month passed. When I asked again, he sighed loudly. "Unexpected expenses," he said. "Things happen." The words came with a sharp edge, as if I were the problem for remembering. The day I truly felt myself bottom out arrived on a gray Tuesday in November. I woke up with a fever that made the room tilt. My chest ached when I breathed. I coughed until my ribs hurt. I had always prided myself on being sturdy, but that week my body refused to cooperate. I tried to stand and nearly fell. The fear that rose in me was not dramatic. It was practical. I was 66. If I passed out, who would find me? I called Henry. My fingers shook as I held the phone to my ear. He answered distractedly, and I could hear Marlene's voice in the background. "Henry," I said, and my voice sounded thin. "I'm sick. I need to go to the doctor. Can you come with me?" There was a pause, then a sigh. "Mom, I can't," he said. "We have an appointment with an architect. We've been waiting months." "I just need a couple of hours," I whispered. "I'm scared to go alone." "Can't you call a neighbor?" he asked, irritation sliding into his tone. "Marlene says independent adults need to handle their own stuff." "Marlene says." The phrase landed like a stamp. "I'm your mother," I said. "Since when am I stuff?" "Oh, Mom, don't be dramatic," he replied. "It's just the flu. Drink tea. Rest." Then he hung up. I sat on the edge of my bed holding the phone, staring at it as if it might explain how this had become my life. The fever made everything feel distant, but his words were sharp and clear. In that moment, with my body weak and my house silent, I understood something I had refused to see. I was alone, and my son was not coming. And came that afternoon, because she noticed my curtains hadn't moved. She knocked until I opened the door, and when she saw my face she didn't ask permission. She stepped inside and guided me back to bed. She brought medicine. She made soup. She checked my forehead and shook her head. "This isn't right," she said. "Your son should be here." I tried to defend him even then, murmuring about responsibilities, but Anne's gaze didn't soften. "He can have a life," she said. "But he can't erase yours." My recovery took 2 weeks. 2 long weeks of coughing and sweating and waking in the night with fear clinging to my chest. Henry did not call once. When I finally felt strong enough to stand in the kitchen again, I realized that if Anne hadn't noticed, I might have lain there alone until the fever broke me in a way I couldn't recover from. When Henry finally called, it was as if nothing had happened. "Mom," he said lightly, "can you make that lasagna Marlene likes? Her parents are coming over." Something in me went still. For 30 years my mouth had formed yes automatically. This time the word didn't come. I stared out my kitchen window and felt a strange quiet solidify inside me. "I can't," I said. There was silence, then disbelief. "You can't," he repeated. "What do you mean you can't?" "I have other plans," I replied, and even as I said it I realized I didn't. Not yet. But I wanted them. I wanted a life that did not pivot around his convenience. "What plans?" he demanded. "What could you possibly have going on?" "My own," I said, and my voice steadied. "You didn't call for 2 weeks when I was sick. I'm done being available on command." He exhaled sharply. "Don't start," he snapped. "You're emotionally blackmailing me." "I'm setting a boundary," I replied. He hung up. After the line went dead, my hands shook. I expected guilt to swallow me whole. Instead I felt, beneath the fear, a thin thread of relief. I didn't like the distance, but I liked the sensation of choosing something for myself. I began to test that choice in small ways. I walked with and in the afternoons. I pulled weeds in my garden. I read books that had sat unopened for years. I spoke with neighbors I had once only waved at, and I realized how many lives existed on my street that had nothing to do with Henry. There was comfort in that discovery, and grief too. How much had I missed by making my son my entire world? That weekend Anne invited me to sit on her porch with her, wrapped in blankets, watching the street as if it were a slow, ordinary parade. She talked about her own children, grown and scattered, and how she had learned a lesson late. Love that requires you to shrink is not love, it is control dressed in familiar clothing. I listened, embarrassed by how hungry I was for simple kindness. When I admitted I didn't know how to stop hoping Henry would return to the son I remembered, and didn't scold me. She asked me what I wanted my days to look like if I stopped waiting. The question landed softly, but it shook me. I wanted quiet mornings without dread. I wanted laughter that wasn't borrowed from someone else. I wanted to feel safe in my own home. Saying those things out loud made my eyes burn. and reached for my hand and held it like a promise. She said I could grieve and set limits, both at once. 3 weeks after I told him no, Henry arrived at my door without warning. Marlene was with him. Henry's face was tight with anger. Marlene's expression was calm in the way people are calm when they feel superior. "We need to talk," Henry said, stepping inside before I could answer. He sat down as if he were entitled to the space. Marlene followed and perched on the sofa, eyes scanning my home like a judge. "Go ahead," I said, keeping my voice level. Henry leaned forward. "What's going on with you?" he demanded. "You refused to help, and now people are saying you're spreading lies about us." "Lies?" I asked. "And told her sister," he said, jaw clenched. "And it got around. That I abandoned you. That I'm ungrateful. Do you realize what that could do to my reputation?" Marlene sighed. Theatrical. "Henry works hard," she said. "He can't have his image damaged because you're upset." I stared at them, and the absurdity rose in me like heat. "So you're worried about your image," I said, looking at Henry, "not whether your mother was alone and scared." Marlene's smile sharpened. "Ella," she said, voice sweet, "you're 66. It's time you grew up and stopped acting like a child who needs constant attention." The room went quiet. I waited for Henry to object, to defend me. He didn't. He stared at his shoes like a boy told to sit still. The silence told me everything. "So that's it," I said softly. "You'll let her talk to me like that in my own home?" Henry looked up, irritation flashing. "She's telling the truth, Mom. You play the victim." "The victim," I repeated, and my voice cooled. "I asked you for help when I was sick. I asked for respect. If that makes me a victim, then yes." He stood abruptly. "It was just the flu," he snapped. "I can't cancel my whole life for your drama." Then he said it, harsh and final, as if he had been waiting to throw it like a stone. "No one asked you to sacrifice your life for me. That was your choice." For a moment I couldn't breathe. It felt as if he had ripped the meaning out of every early morning and every overtime shift. All those years of going without, all those moments of choosing him over myself, reduced to an unwanted burden. I heard my own voice, calm in a way that surprised me. "You're right," I said. "They were my choices." Marlene relaxed, mistaking my tone for surrender. Henry's shoulders eased. "And this," I continued, looking around at my living room, "this house, my savings, everything I own, those are my choices too." Henry frowned. "What are you talking about?" I walked to the small table where I kept my papers. I pulled out the will I had written years ago, when I still believed Henry's love was inevitable. I held it up and watched his eyes widen. "What are you doing?" he asked, the alarm rising. "I'm making a new choice," I said, and carried the paper toward the shredder. "I'm choosing not to leave everything to someone who treats me like an inconvenience." Henry lunged. "Mom, wait." But the machine was already humming, and the paper fed through, disappearing into thin strips. Marlene's composure cracked. "You can't do that," she shrieked. "That's insane." I turned to them, and for the first time in months I felt taller in my own home. "No," I said quietly. "What's insane is believing you can threaten me into gratitude." Henry stared at the shredded paper as if it were part of him. His voice dropped lower. "You'll fix this," he said. "You'll call your lawyer and make a new will." "And if I don't?" I asked, meeting his gaze. His face tightened, and for a second I saw a hardness in him I didn't recognize. "Then you'll find out what it means to be alone," he said. I looked at my son and realized the loneliness he threatened had already happened. It had happened in fevered nights when he didn't call. It had happened in empty weeks. It had happened every time he chose peace with Marlene over respect for me. "I already know," I said, and my voice did not shake. Henry's eyes narrowed. Marlene's mouth tightened. The air in my living room felt suddenly thin, and somewhere deep inside me, a quiet fear flickered. Whatever came next, I knew it would not be gentle. The days after Henry's final visit settled into a quiet I had never known before. Not the anxious quiet of waiting for a phone call that might never come, but a steady, breathable silence. Morning light entered my kitchen the same way it always had, yet it felt different now, as if the house itself had exhaled with me. I woke without dread. I made coffee without rushing. For the first time in decades, my schedule belonged entirely to me. The legal process moved forward with a precision that felt almost unreal. I attended meetings with lawyers and social workers, people who listened to me without interrupting, without minimizing, without telling me to be more understanding. Each time I spoke, I felt a little stronger, as if my voice were reclaiming space it had been denied for years. I told my story again, and with every telling it lost its sting and gained clarity. What had happened was not a misunderstanding. It was not a family disagreement. It was abuse, carefully dressed as concern. Neighbors who had once only nodded at me now stopped to talk. Some brought casseroles. Some brought questions they were afraid to ask directly. Others brought their own stories, whispered confessions of adult children who took too much, demanded too much, and gave nothing back. I listened, and I realized how many people were quietly carrying the same shame I had carried, believing it was their fault for loving too much, and became a constant presence, not as a caretaker but as a companion. We walked together every afternoon, slow and deliberate, noticing things I had once rushed past, the way the trees leaned toward the sun, the rhythm of dogs barking in distant yards, the laughter of children riding bikes at the end of the street. Life had been happening all along. I had simply been too busy sacrificing to notice. The newspaper article came out on a Sunday morning. I didn't read it right away. I let it sit on the table while I finished my breakfast, while I watered my plants, while I reminded myself that whatever words were printed there no longer defined me. When I finally read it, I felt no triumph, only a sober sense of closure. My name was there, yes, but not as a victim. As a woman who chose herself. Henry did not contact me again after that day on my porch. I heard through others that Marlene had left him, that their marriage had collapsed under the same weight of control and entitlement that had poisoned my life. I felt no joy in that knowledge, but I felt no guilt either. Consequences had arrived, and they belonged to them. Some nights I still thought of the boy Henry had been. The child who clung to my hand crossing busy streets. The teenager who begged me to stay up late and talk about his dreams. I allowed myself those memories without letting them pull me backward. Grief, I learned, does not require surrender. You can mourn what was without reopening the door to what broke you. I rearranged my home slowly, thoughtfully. I took down some photographs and kept others. Not as reminders of sacrifice, but as markers of time. I painted the living room a soft, warm color I had always liked but never chosen because someone else might not approve. Each small decision felt like an act of reclamation. At 66, I was not starting over. I was continuing, without apology, without fear, without shrinking. I volunteered at a local center for women my age, listening to stories that mirrored my own in ways that felt both painful and healing. I told them the truth I had learned too late but was determined to share now. Love is not proven by how much you endure. It is proven by how much respect remains. Sometimes, late in the evening, I sat alone in my kitchen with a cup of tea and thought about the woman I had been for 40 years. The woman who believed that giving everything was the same as loving well. I did not hate her. I honored her endurance. But I no longer let her make my choices. I had lost a son, yes. But I had gained myself. And that, I finally understood, was not a tragedy. It was the beginning. Time did not rush after that. It unfolded in a way I had never allowed it to before. Slow, deliberate, almost cautious, as if it were learning who I was now. I stopped measuring my days by who called or who didn't. I stopped listening for footsteps that never came. Instead, I learned the sound of my own breathing in the quiet house, the steady reassurance that I was still here, still capable, still whole. There were moments when grief crept in without warning. It arrived in ordinary places, while folding a shirt Henry had once left behind, while passing the school where I had waited for him on rainy afternoons, while hearing a young man laugh with his mother in the grocery store aisle. The ache was sharp, but no longer consuming. I let it pass through me instead of fighting it. I learned that grief only becomes poison when you pretend it isn't there, and noticed the change before I did. One afternoon, as we sat on her porch watching the sun dip behind the trees, she smiled at me in a way that made me curious. "You're lighter," she said. "Not happier exactly. Just lighter." I thought about it and realized she was right. The constant tension I had carried in my shoulders, the vigilance that came from waiting to be needed or rejected, had faded. I wasn't bracing myself anymore. I was simply living. I began to make plans that did not involve anyone else's permission. I signed up for a local art class, something I had once dismissed as impractical. On the first day, I sat among women and men my age, all of us tentative, all of us quietly excited. When I dipped my brush into paint for the first time, my hand trembled, not from weakness, but from the unfamiliar freedom of doing something purely because I wanted to. The canvas did not judge me. It accepted every stroke. Slowly, my world expanded. Not outward in dramatic ways, but inward, in ways that mattered more. I read books that challenged me, not because they were useful, but because they made me think. I cooked meals for myself that I enjoyed, not meals designed to impress someone who would never be satisfied. I slept better. I laughed more easily. Every so often, someone would ask about Henry. The question always came carefully, wrapped in concern. I learned to answer simply. "We're not in contact," I would say. I did not explain unless asked. I did not defend my choice. The people who mattered understood. The ones who didn't were no longer people I needed to convince. One afternoon, months later, I received a letter from the foundation that now held my inheritance. They thanked me for my contribution and told me about a young woman who had been able to return to school because of the funds. She was a single mother, working nights, determined to build something better for her child. I held the letter in my hands and felt a quiet, profound sense of rightness. My sacrifices had not been meaningless after all. They had simply been redirected to a place where gratitude still lived. That night, I stood in my living room and looked around at the home I had nearly lost. The walls held memories, yes, but they no longer trapped me inside them. This house was not a shrine to the past. It was a place where my present could breathe. I thought of Henry then, not with anger, not with longing, but with acceptance. He had made his choices. I had made mine. The distance between us was no longer a wound. It was a boundary, firm and necessary. At 66, I was not invisible. I was not finished. I was not weak because I had loved deeply. I was strong because I had finally learned where love must end to make room for dignity. When I turned off the lights and went to bed, the house was silent again. But it was a silence filled with something I had never known before. Peace. The peace did not erase memory. It reshaped it. In the weeks that followed, I found myself thinking not only about Henry, but about the woman I had been before motherhood consumed every corner of my identity. She had been young once, hopeful in ways that were not attached to anyone else's success. She laughed loudly. She had dreamed small, personal dreams, owning a sewing machine of her own, traveling to the coast one day, learning to dance even though she was clumsy. None of those dreams were wrong. They were simply postponed so long they became invisible. I began to retrieve them gently, one by one. I set up a small sewing table near the window, not for factory work or rushed repairs, but for pleasure. I stitched slowly, choosing fabrics because I liked their texture, their color, the way they caught the light. There was no deadline, no quota. Sometimes I made things that served no purpose at all except to exist. That felt revolutionary. Occasionally, guilt tried to creep back in. It came disguised as questions. What kind of mother walks away? What kind of woman lets her only child fall? On those days, I reminded myself of the full truth, not the edited version I had once clung to. I reminded myself of the phones smashed against the wall, of the threats spoken calmly as if they were reasonable, of the plans made to erase me from my own life. Love does not survive coercion. The family does not demand silence. One afternoon, while I was watering my plants, a young woman stopped at my gate. She introduced herself hesitantly and explained that she lived 2 streets over. She had read the article. Her voice trembled as she spoke. She told me her own mother was in a similar situation, quietly controlled by adult children who decided everything for her. "I didn't know it had a name," she said. "I thought it was just how things were." We talked for nearly an hour. When she left, she hugged me tightly, as if I had given her something she didn't know she was allowed to take. That was when I understood that my story no longer belonged only to me. It has become a mirror for others, a reminder that it is never too late to say no. I did not become hard. I did not become bitter. What I became was selective. I learned that compassion without boundaries is self-erasure. I learned that forgiveness is not an obligation, but a choice that must come with safety and accountability. I learned that being alone is not the same as being abandoned. And I celebrated my 67th birthday quietly, with cake and laughter and no speeches about family duty. She gave me a small notebook and told me to write whatever I wanted in it. I began to fill it with thoughts, memories, and observations, proof that my voice had not disappeared just because I had been quiet for so long. Sometimes, late at night, I imagined Henry reading the article again, replaying moments he once dismissed. I did not wish him harm. I wished him awareness. Whether it ever came was no longer my concern. Parenthood, I learned, does not mean eternal responsibility for another adult's character. The final thing I let go of was the need for closure from him. Closure is something we give ourselves when the other person cannot or will not provide it. Mine came quietly, on an ordinary morning, when I realized I no longer rehearsed conversations that would never happen. I lived. Simply. Fully. Honestly. And that, in the end, was the greatest inheritance of all.